Picture this. It's around 400,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Germany, and an ancient human is standing at the edge of a clearing holding something that is, in its own humble, unassuming way, one of the most consequential objects in the entire history of life on this planet. It's a wooden spear, about 6 feet long, fire-hardened at the tip, carefully balanced with more weight toward the front than the back, clearly made by someone who'd thought about this problem for a while. The person holding it is not particularly large, not particularly fast, definitely not equipped with claws or natural armor of any kind, but they have this spear, and more importantly, they have something even more significant: the accumulated understanding that making something fly through the air and hit something else at a distance, rather than getting close enough to touch it directly, is the entire game. That moment, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of years of progressive human innovation, represents the beginning of a technological journey that eventually, through a long, improbable, and frankly astonishing chain of incremental human ingenuity, produced the firearm. Not directly, not quickly, not in any single dramatic leap that makes for a clean, satisfying story, but in a continuous, unbroken line of human problem-solving that connects that fire-hardened wooden spear to a rifled steel barrel with more directness and more genuine evolutionary continuity than most people ever consider when they think about where guns actually came from. So here's what this video is actually about, because the title requires a bit of honest framing right at the start. Guns themselves weren't invented by ancient humans in the deep pre-civilization sense we typically explore on this channel. The firearm as we'd recognize it arrived considerably later in human history. Once settled civilizations, metallurgy and chemistry had all developed far enough to make it possible. But the ancient human contribution to guns is far more significant and far more direct than most people realize, because ancient humans invented and progressively refined every single core concept underlying firearm technology: projectile force, ranged accuracy, mechanical launch assistance, accumulated propellant power, and the fundamental strategic insight that distance is safety across hundreds of thousands of years of iterative, accumulated innovation before any civilization existed to provide the specific materials that eventually made gunpowder weapons possible. Understanding how guns eventually got invented requires understanding exactly what ancient humans figured out first, because without the ancient foundation, the eventual invention makes no sense at all. Let's start at the very beginning of this entire story, which is considerably older than most people would guess, because throwing things accurately is genuinely one of the oldest, most consequential human technological capabilities, and it didn't appear fully formed overnight. We discussed in our thumbs video how the specific combination of human shoulder anatomy and hand dexterity produced a throwing capability genuinely extraordinary by animal kingdom standards, but it's worth expanding on exactly what made throwing such a revolutionary survival technology, specifically regarding the trajectory it set ancient human weapons development on for the next several 100,000 years. The core insight embedded in throwing something at a target, so obvious it barely seems worth stating until you actually sit with its full implications, is this: you can deliver lethal force to a target without being within range of that target's response. This is so fundamentally different from every other form of animal combat that it deserves real emphasis. In virtually every other predator-prey or competitor-competitor physical conflict in nature, delivering any kind of lethal or significant force requires being close enough to receive return force from whatever you're attacking. Claws require contact range. Biting requires contact range. Horns, antlers, kicking, all of it requires close enough proximity that the target can respond in kind. A thrown rock or spear breaks this rule completely. It delivers force from a distance that, if sufficient, entirely removes you from the equation of whatever the target can do in response. That insight embedded in the very first deliberately thrown projectile any ancient human ever aimed at anything contains within it, in embryonic conceptual form, every subsequent weapons development in the entire history of human technology, including and eventually culminating in firearms. Every weapon development from that point forward was essentially an attempt to solve the same basic problem: how do we deliver more force, more accurately from greater distance, with less physical effort required from the person doing the delivering? That problem statement, worked on continuously and iteratively by countless ancient and eventually modern human minds across an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, is the entire story of weapons technology from wooden spear to steel firearm. Let's talk about the wooden throwing spear specifically, because it represents the first major deliberate optimization step in this entire journey, and the sophistication involved is considerably greater than the object's simplicity might initially suggest. The Schöningen spears, found in Germany and dating to approximately 300 to 400,000 years ago, represent some of the oldest complete wooden spear implements ever found, and researchers studying them have noted that they displayed genuine attention to optimization, weighted toward the front for better flight stability, made from specific wood species with appropriate flex and hardness characteristics, and sized in ways that appear calibrated for effective throwing range rather than purely for close quarters use. These aren't accidental sticks. They're deliberately engineered projectile weapons, representing the work of ancient minds that had already grasped the core engineering principles of throwing weapon optimization, that weight distribution, material selection, and dimensional proportion all affect performance, and had applied that understanding to produce meaningfully better weapons than naive construction would have produced. Now let's talk about the atlatl, because this represents the first genuinely mechanical amplification of throwing power in the entire history of human weapons development, and it connects directly to both the ancient human story and the eventual firearm in ways that are genuinely illuminating. We covered the atlatl briefly in our survival methods video, but it deserves considerably more specific attention here. An atlatl is essentially a lever that extends the effective throwing arm length, allowing a hunter to impart considerably more rotational force to a spear during the throwing motion than the physical arm length alone permits. The physics are straightforward. A longer lever arm during the throwing motion produces higher tip velocity for the projectile at release, translating directly into greater range, greater impact force, and potentially greater accuracy through improved release control. The result, practically speaking, is that an atlatl-equipped hunter can throw a spear with roughly 2 to 3 times the effective force of an unaided throw, extending effective hunting range dramatically and turning an already formidable hunting weapon into something approaching genuinely impressive ranged capability. The atlatl matters in this story specifically because it represents the first time ancient humans introduced a mechanical intermediate between the human body and the projectile, a device whose sole purpose was to amplify and improve the projectile delivery rather than being the weapon itself. This conceptual step, the idea that you could build something that makes the weapon delivery more powerful than the human body alone could produce, is directly ancestral to every subsequent mechanical and eventually chemical weapons development in the entire history of human technology. The atlatl's conceptual DNA runs directly through the crossbow, through early cannon design, and ultimately through the firearm, in an unbroken line of humans asking the same fundamental question. What if we built something that amplifies the force we can deliver rather than relying purely on what human biology can produce unaided? Let's talk about the bow and arrow, because this represents the next major leap in this progression and is arguably the single most significant conceptual precursor to firearm technology that ancient and early human innovation produced. The bow achieves something genuinely remarkable, and genuinely new in the history of weapons development. It stores energy progressively as the archer draws, accumulating potential. Energy in the flexed bow limbs over the entire draw length, and then releases all of that stored energy at once into the arrow at the moment of release. This energy storage and sudden release mechanism is the core conceptual principle underlying every firearm ever built. A firearm doesn't work fundamentally differently from a bow in conceptual terms. Both store energy in some form, whether elastic potential energy in bent wood or chemical potential energy in propellant, and both release that stored energy suddenly and directionally into a projectile at the moment of firing. The bow is, in the most direct conceptual sense, a slow-motion firearm, or more accurately, a firearm is a bow that replaced elastic energy storage with chemical energy storage. A substitution that amplified the available force by orders of magnitude, but left the underlying conceptual architecture essentially unchanged. Bows also introduced another genuinely consequential innovation: the separation of the human aiming mechanism from the energy delivery mechanism. When you throw a spear, the same physical action that delivers the force also determines the aim, which means any inaccuracy in the throwing motion directly affects both force and accuracy simultaneously. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. With a bow, you can take time to carefully, deliberately aim before committing to the release, holding the drawn bow steady while adjusting your aim, then releasing when aim is correct. This decoupling of aiming from energy delivery is another concept that runs directly and fundamentally through firearm design, where the trigger mechanism allows the shooter to take careful aim before committing to the shot without any loss of the stored propellant energy during the aiming process. Now let's talk about something genuinely important regarding what this entire ancient weapons development story tells us about the kind of cognitive and cultural process that eventually produced firearms, because this connects directly to themes we've explored throughout this entire series. Every single step in this progression, from thrown rock to wooden spear to balanced throwing spear to atlatl to bow and arrow, happened through the same basic mechanism we've documented throughout this series for every other ancient human technological development: accumulated, multi-generational, iterative improvement, with each generation inheriting the best current solution and working to improve it slightly, occasionally achieving a significant conceptual leap that opened entirely new directions for subsequent improvement. Nobody sat down one afternoon and invented the atlatl from first principles through pure philosophical reasoning. The atlatl almost certainly developed gradually through incremental experimentation with different throwing aids, some of which worked slightly better than others, with the better working versions being preferentially retained and further refined across generations. The bow similarly didn't appear fully formed, but developed through a likely long progression of intermediate forms, possibly including throwing boards with notched ends for shorter darts, and various other intermediate configurations that each represented some improvement over pure throwing, but fell short of the full bow's capabilities. What the fire gatherings and evening storytelling culture we've discussed throughout this entire series were doing, alongside all the animal behavior knowledge and food safety information and social relationship management they also transmitted, was transmitting weapons technology knowledge across generations, allowing each generation of ancient humans to start from the current best solution rather than reinventing everything from scratch and driving the progressive improvement that eventually produced the bow from the original thrown rock across hundreds of thousands of years of patient accumulated innovation. Let's address something genuinely important about what eventually enabled the final leap from mechanical projectile weapons to chemical projectile weapons, meaning actual firearms, because this is where the ancient human story connects to the eventual invention through a chain of necessary prerequisites. Gunpowder, the critical enabling technology for the firearm, was discovered in 9th century China, and its eventual application to weapons followed a progression that should look very familiar given everything we've discussed about ancient human weapons development: gradual, iterative, incrementally improving toward greater force, range, accuracy, and practical usability. The earliest gunpowder weapons were genuinely crude, often as dangerous to the user as to any target, requiring enormous technical refinement across multiple generations to become the reliable, accurate weapons firearms eventually became. But here's what's crucial for understanding how ancient human innovation connects to this eventual development. Gunpowder weapons required an already existing tradition of sophisticated projectile weapon design to become anything more than a dangerous novelty. Early firearms were essentially tubes that directed a chemical explosion to propel a projectile in a specific direction, and making that work as an effective weapon required exactly the accumulated understanding of projectile physics, bore geometry, and launch optimization that centuries of mechanical projectile weapon design had already developed. The metallurgists and craftspeople who built early firearms were drawing on a deep, accumulated tradition of understanding what makes a projectile weapon work, a tradition that traced directly back through the bow, the crossbow, the catapult, and ultimately to the same ancient human insights about projectile force and distance advantage that produced the first carefully balanced throwing spear hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Let's talk about something fascinating here regarding the specific role of metallurgy in enabling the transition from mechanical to chemical projectile weapons, because this connection is genuinely important and genuinely underappreciated. Metal tools appear in human history as a direct outgrowth of the same stone tool working tradition that ancient humans developed and refined across hundreds of thousands of years before any civilization existed. We discussed stone knapping extensively in our thumbs video, and the progression from stone tool working to metal tool working, while representing a genuine technological leap enabled by specific metallurgical knowledge that developed within early civilizations, represents a continuation of the same basic tradition of carefully shaping hard material into useful forms that ancient humans had been practicing for most of human evolutionary history. The metal barrel of a firearm is, in the most direct ancestry sense, the great many times great descendant of the first carefully knapped stone point that an ancient human hafted onto a wooden shaft with sinew to produce a more effective spear tip. Both represent the application of accumulated material working knowledge toward the specific goal of making a projectile weapon more effective, using whatever the most capable available material happened to be. Ancient humans used stone because it was the most capable available hard material for the purpose. Eventual firearms designers used steel because it was the most capable available material for containing and directing the enormous forces that gunpowder combustion produces. The goal was identical. The specific material was different. The entire intellectual and practical tradition connecting one to the other is unbroken. Let's address something genuinely fascinating about the crossbow specifically here, because it represents a particularly interesting intermediate step that directly bridges the ancient human mechanical projectile tradition and eventual firearm design in ways most people don't fully appreciate. The crossbow introduced something genuinely new to the bow's basic design: a mechanical latching mechanism that holds the bow in the drawn, stored energy state without requiring the shooter to maintain any physical effort while aiming, allowing the weapon to be held indefinitely at full draw while the shooter takes whatever time is needed to aim precisely before releasing. This locking mechanism, holding stored energy in a ready-to-release state and releasing it through a trigger action, is the most direct mechanical ancestor of the firearm's trigger and firing mechanism, conceptually if not mechanically. A crossbow's trigger mechanism and a firearm's trigger mechanism solve exactly the same problem in exactly the same way, holding accumulated force ready for directed release at the moment the shooter chooses to commit to the shot. Now let's talk about something genuinely important regarding what the entire arc of this story tells us about the nature of technological invention generally, because it connects directly to themes we've explored throughout this entire series regarding how ancient human innovation actually worked. There are no clean invention moments in this story. There's no single person who invented the atlatl or the bow or eventually gunpowder weapons in some isolated flash of individual genius. Each of these developments emerged from a continuous, multi-generational, collaborative, iterative process of accumulated improvement, with each generation inheriting the best current solution and building forward from it, occasionally achieving significant leaps when a particularly novel idea proved dramatically better than existing approaches, but always building on a foundation of accumulated prior development rather than starting from nothing. This is exactly the pattern we've documented throughout this entire series for ancient human technological development, and it's worth stating clearly as a general principle because it fundamentally changes how we should think about ancient human intelligence and creativity. Ancient humans weren't less creative or less innovative than modern humans. They were applying exactly the same basic cognitive capabilities toward exactly the same fundamental problems, making things that fly more accurately and hit harder, keeping people warm and fed, staying safe from predators and weather, across an environment with different available materials and different accumulated knowledge foundation than modern inventors work within. The difference between an ancient human who invented a better balanced throwing spear and a modern engineer who improved a firearm's trigger mechanism is environmental context and available accumulated knowledge, not any difference in the underlying creative and problem-solving capability being applied. Let's bring in something genuinely interesting here regarding the social transmission dimension of ancient weapons knowledge specifically, because this connects directly to the evening fire-gathering culture we've discussed throughout this series. Weapons design knowledge, exactly like food safety knowledge, fire-making technique, and all the other survival-critical information ancient humans maintained through their evening storytelling and demonstration culture would have been actively, deliberately transmitted across generations through exactly the same social mechanisms. A better atlatl design that some particularly innovative ancient human figured out through experimentation wasn't that person's private advantage for a single lifetime. It got demonstrated, discussed, refined through collective input, and transmitted forward through the group's accumulated knowledge base, becoming the new starting point for the next generation's further experimentation and improvement. This social transmission of weapons technology knowledge is exactly what made the eventual progression from spear to bow to crossbow to firearm possible across civilizational timescales. Without reliable, accurate, detailed social transmission of technical knowledge across generations, each generation would have had to rediscover everything from scratch, and the accumulated progression that eventually produced firearms simply couldn't have happened. The evening fire culture of ancient humans, maintaining and transmitting technical knowledge through story, demonstration, and collaborative discussion, was the essential infrastructure underlying every subsequent technological development in human history, including the eventual firearm, even though the specific content of those transmissions changed dramatically as the knowledge base grew and the available materials evolved across thousands of years of human cultural development. Let's address something genuinely worth sitting with directly before we close, because it ties this entire story together in a way that's genuinely illuminating about what ancient human innovation actually was and what it meant. The ancient human who stood in that German clearing 400,000 years ago, holding a carefully balanced wooden spear, didn't know they were at the beginning of a chain of innovation that would eventually produce firearms. They were just solving the immediate problem in front of them as effectively as the available materials and accumulated knowledge of their time allowed. The insight they were embodying, that distance is safety and that mechanical cleverness can increase deliverable force, was already complete and already correct. Everything that followed across the next hundreds of thousands of years was refinement, amplification, and material substitution in service of that same fundamental insight. Let's bring this all the way back to where we started. That ancient human in the German clearing with their carefully made throwing spear, because this image deserves a final appreciation in light of everything we've just traced forward from it. That person was not primitive in any meaningful sense. They were solving a genuinely difficult engineering problem, projectile weapon optimization, with remarkable sophistication using the materials and knowledge available to them. They were participating in an ongoing, multi-generational collaborative project of weapons development that their parents contributed to before them, and their children would contribute to after them, each generation building forward from where the last left off. They were doing, in other words, exactly what every human innovator throughout all of history has done, inheriting the best current solution, understanding it deeply, and trying to make it a little bit better. The firearm, several 100,000 years and an almost incomprehensible amount of accumulated human ingenuity later, represents what happens when that process runs long enough, in a species clever enough, with eventually enough material sophistication and chemical knowledge available, to make the next leap that ancient humans couldn't make yet because the prerequisite knowledge and materials hadn't accumulated sufficiently. Not because ancient humans lacked the cognitive capability for the insight, because the world hadn't given them gunpowder yet, and even the most brilliant, ancient, innovative mind can only work with what the world currently has available to offer. So how did ancient humans eventually invent guns? They didn't, in a direct literal sense, and this video has been honest about that from the beginning. What they did was considerably more important. They invented the concepts, they established the tradition, they built the accumulated understanding, and they maintained the social transmission systems across hundreds of thousands of years of continuous, iterative, collaborative innovation that made the eventual invention not just possible, but essentially inevitable the moment the remaining prerequisite materials and chemical knowledge became available. The gun didn't come from nowhere. It came from that clearing in Germany, and from every ancient human hand that picked up a spear, adjusted its balance, threw it, watched where it landed, thought about why, and started working on what to try differently next time.